Welcome back to C's Listening Room. I'm C, and you're not in a listening room, you're in a bedroom. But this is where I do my videos because I've got better lighting in here. Today, I've got a Canadian classic for you. This is God Shuffled His Feet from Crash Test Dummies, 1993 release. I bought this at the exact same time I bought the last album that I featured, which was Great Big Sea. This was a $1 CD, and that kind of made me a little sad because I found this at the same store, same dollar rack. I bought them at the same time. I'm like, man, I can't believe that this is now in the buck bin. This has really fallen from grace if that's the case. And they actually had two copies of it. They had two different copies of the CD stuck on the buck bin with a bunch of obscure Christmas music and stuff. And I thought that was a little unfortunate because I remember actually being there in the 90s when this album came out and when people were buying it. And it was a fairly popular album. But Crash Test Dummies, alternative rock band, they had a couple unconventional instruments for a rock band. Like Ellen Reed played accordion on a few songs, and there's a guy named Benjamin Darville who played mandolin and harmonica. So they weren't your typical rock band. They included a couple kind of non-rock instruments or uncommon instruments for a rock band. But they were probably best known for their vocals. Brad Roberts had that really, really deep, low voice that was instantly recognizable. And I think pretty much at the time, back in the 90s, that's what people associated them with. They knew it because of the voice. He was also the songwriter. And I would say that he's probably one of the better songwriters that I've heard. I mean, there are mainstream songwriters. There are these songwriters that churn out all these songs for mainstream acts, but they're literally, they're kind of simplistic. It reads like very simple literature if you were to read the lyrics. I'm not a big fan of the real professional, accomplished songwriters. Brad Roberts was not a mainstream songwriter. He was this singer in an alternative rock band. But he's got a really, really great style of songwriting. He's kind of intellectual, kind of humorous at the same time. He's got a lot of interesting observations. He just has a lot of unusual and different themes that he writes about. Like one of the songs is called How Does a Duck Know? And he asks the question, how does a male duck know his wife from other ducks? Well, first of all, ducks don't have wives, but beyond that, it's an interesting question. How does a male duck know his partner from other ducks? It's kind of humorous. It's a silly question, but that's his songwriting style, and he sings about stuff that other people probably wouldn't even think about writing a song about. My favorite on the album is Afternoons and Coffee Spoons. Now, I'm in my mid-40s. I'm not elderly yet. But the song is about aging and the process of getting old. And I'm not in my 20s anymore. And so I do feel some of the effects of aging. So I can understand the song to a degree. And this is, someday I'll have a disappearing hairline. Someday I'll wear pajamas in the daytime. It's clever. It's just that here's this younger guy writing about getting old or how he perceives it would feel to get old, and he does it in a very humorous way. So I think he's one of the great songwriters, and it's interesting because a lot of the songwriters that I actually do like are Canadian. I think some of Bruce Coburn's stuff is good. I think Gord Downey of the Tragically Hip, you can't really understand what he's singing about. He's very cryptic, and he kind of jumps from thing to thing, topic to topic, point to point in his songs, but it's very intellectual. Obviously, the lyrics of Rush's songs are very intellectual and very in-depth. And so it's interesting because it's strange that, for some reason, I just think that some of the Canadian songwriters are, in some ways, some of the best I've heard. And I would consider Brad Roberts to be one of them. I would say he's probably one of the best I've heard. And just throughout the album, lots of great songwriting, lots of interesting lyrics. The lyric sheet is a great read, but doesn't always translate well to the songs, unfortunately. I think that's one of the reasons this album is now in the $1 bin. They have a lot to say. They have some interesting things to say, but sometimes it doesn't always translate to exciting music. It's so in-depth, and they're trying to get a point across, or they're trying to say something, but the music itself is a little forgettable. Sometimes it's a little slow and drags it down. I do not like the track Untitled. There's a track on here called Untitled. It's the last song on the album, and it's an instrumental. And for a band that's mostly noticeable for their vocal style, and for a band whose real strong point is the songwriting, I don't think an instrumental is really a good idea. I don't know why they did an instrumental, but I don't have a thing against instrumentals. I like instrumentals a lot, but this is really not the band to be doing this. The vocals and the songwriting really are their strong points, and it just defeats the purpose altogether to have an instrumental track, especially one that adds nothing to the album. So it's a little hit or miss musically, but I mean, it's got that song on it. What can I say? That song itself was a big hit. People still recognize that song. And for that reason, I would say this album is still pretty much a classic. The fact that there's such a recognizable, memorable song on this album, and one that was kind of around for a while. It wasn't one of those songs that an alternative radio station would play for like 2 or 3 weeks and then move on and kind of ignore it after that. You know, this was actually a pretty well-known song, and people were listening to that song and buying this album for that song alone for probably a few years. People pretty much bought this album just for that song. That song was the reason this album sold as well as it did. But you know what? That's okay. Because most of these alternative bands, especially I think the ones out of Canada, never even got that far. They never had something quite as big as that. When I bought this CD, my girlfriend saw it and she's like, I don't know this CD. I don't know who those guys are. I've never seen that CD before. Then I put it on and that song came on. She's like, oh, this is that song. I know this one. I'm like, yeah, I told you you'd know this one. So that's my point. That song is enduring. It has lasted this long. To this day, people will hear that song from 1993 and they will still recognize it because it was a pretty big song for its time. And for a band like this, a band that really was not a mainstream act, especially one out of Canada, it's still a familiar song. It was a big enough hit where people to this day still remember it. And that's an accomplishment. And I'm not terribly sad anymore that when I think about it now, that this band was in the $1 bin, because they at least still made something and had a moment there that few other bands like them ever would have had. And I would say that just that song alone makes this something of a classic. People still remember the band too. I mean, there are still people out there that I'm sure you mention them and they say, oh yeah, that was that song. So yeah, it's fallen from grace. It's now being sold in $1 bins. But you know what? These guys fared better than a lot of other bands did in the mid-90s. Especially for a band that was not really geared towards top 40 airplay and multi-million record sales. Like, I mean, obviously this wasn't like a pop album that was meant to sell like 10 or 12 million copies. There was a more intellectual band that used unconventional instruments. So they are kind of lucky that they got as far as they did. And I would say in hindsight, they were probably one of the more successful acts of their ilk. So really, this is pretty much a classic. And again, Afternoons and Coffee Spoons is my personal favorite on here. The hit song is not even my favorite song. The smaller hit actually is the one I prefer. But that's neither here nor there. Again, I could do without the instrumental cut, and there are a couple songs on here that I just, even looking at the titles, I don't remember them, but lyrically they were good. It just musically they didn't really help the album much. I give this one probably 3 stars out of 5 stars. Not to take anything away from its status, this is definitely a classic album of its era and pretty much of its genre. This is at least a mild classic. They had a hit on there that we still remember. A lot of people still like it, and I think a lot of people would listen to this and at least listen to the one big hit and be taken back to wherever they were in the 1990s. I would think I was in middle school in '93. So musically, there's some songs that didn't really hold up. There's some that were probably a little ill-advised. Overall, it's not a bad album. And again, not to beat the point home too many times, but I think they did a lot better with this and accomplished a lot more, at least with the one song, than a lot of other bands that were similar in nature, especially being a Canadian act. So 3 out of 5 stars for God Shuffled His Feet, Crash Test Dummies. Thanks for watching. I'll catch you in my next video.